So the extent to which religion is being driven by the culture wars and the extent to which religion is playing a role in presidential politics is quite large, but it's changed over time. I would say that religion isn't being driven by the culture wars, although of course it is to some extent, but religion is helping to drive the culture wars. And religion itself has become incredibly polarized. That's nothing new, but that rate of polarization, that rate of religion being a source of division has increased over time. And this is kind of surprising because Obama was a religious person, is a religious person. George W. Bush, of course, is a religious person. And they both tried to use religion to bring Americans together and also tried to use religion in order to help their political prospects. And what Trump has done, and I think this is true of most of Trump's politics and most of how he operates as a politician, is to use an issue, in this case religion, to be very divisive, to play to his base, and to push that as far as it would go. Indeed, to push it well past the point that anyone thought would be possible in presidential politics. And previous presidents, or people who have run for the presidency, have thought that that would be political suicide, to basically be so intentionally divisive. And obviously Trump doesn't, he has his own playbook. And you would not think it would work, but it's worked for him so far. I'm not sure it's still going to work in this election, but who knows, we'll have to see. Religious pluralism is still present in American politics, and the extent to which that pluralism or religion in general affects the conduct of American foreign policy is a very complicated question, and it's become more complicated in the age of Trump. A lot of times it might become more complicated, or it might become that those issues might become affected by how religious the president himself is, how personally religious he is, and how he wants to apply that faith to foreign policy. And there are lots of presidents, from Franklin Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower up to Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, and even to a certain extent, Barack Obama. There are lots of examples of presidents where we can actually see, we can trace how presidents have applied their own religious views or their own faith, and sometimes even their own theology to foreign policy. And we can't really do that with Donald Trump because from what we know of his religion, he's not a very religious person himself. And I don't think he's made any secret about that, that he himself is not very pious and he's not theological and he's not very religious, except in a very broad sense. The pluralism that previous presidents like FDR, Eisenhower, Reagan, George W. Bush, the pluralism in which they operated is different. I'm not sure it's there anymore. Certainly the United States is as pluralistic, indeed more pluralistic religiously than it was in the past, in that there are people who aren't just Protestant, there are people who aren't just Christian. There are lots of Muslims and obviously Jews and Hindus and others in the United States who are contributing to that pluralism, but the fastest growing religious group in the United States are the so-called nones. That's not as in a Catholic nun, but as in people who tick none in the census when they're asked what their religious belief is. They have no religion. That doesn't necessarily mean they're atheists, although atheists are a large growing segment of the religious population in the United States. So the United States is becoming more pluralistic. But if we think of pluralism as a political construct or as a political ideology, that pluralism is disappearing. And it's disappearing, as I said before, because of the polarization in American politics and in American society, and the extent to which religion is being deliberately used in a way that previous presidents haven't done. The religion is being deliberately used to polarize the United States and to polarize American politics and society. Now, the extent to which that plays out in the foreign policy realm has become more complicated as well. And it's become more complicated because it's not as easy for Trump as it was for previous presidents, because of what Trump does to actually use religion in that sense, in the foreign policy sense. And the only ways in which I can see in which religion has played a sort of traceable easily identifiable role in American foreign policy today is not in a larger normative or ideological sense, but on specific policy issues, most obviously Israel and moving of the capital to Jerusalem, and just how much support Trump has given to the state of Israel, which plays to the hardest core of Trump's hardcore base, that is white evangelicals. And also for the same reason, because it plays to his base, Trump has been quite active in promoting religious liberty, as previous presidents have done as well. But to Trump, religious liberty seems to be the protection of American Christians, especially Protestants, abroad. And so again, we see this moving away from a pluralistic sense of American religion and how it might apply to foreign policy, and a narrowing specifically to a very, very direct political, partisan, indeed electoral influence. And finally, you asked about Mike Pompeo. There are some people in Trump's foreign policy team who are themselves incredibly religious, much, much, much more so than Donald Trump. Mike Pompeo is one. He's an evangelical. Mike Pence, the vice president, is another. Pence sort of straddles the Catholic evangelical boundary. But it's not clear to me what specific foreign policy instances, aside from religious liberty for Protestants, well, for Christians, and Israel, it's not clear to me in which this is playing out in the foreign policy realm, other than taking the very nationalistic view that white evangelicals have, this ultra hyper patriotism, and applying it to foreign policy, as we see in policy towards especially China, but also other countries. The role that American Catholics have played in American religion, American society, and American politics is a really interesting question, and it's changed a lot over time. For a long time, the dominant religious prejudice in the United States was anti-Catholicism. And indeed, I would say until the 20th century, anti-Catholicism was even stronger in the United States than anti-Semitism was. And that changed in the 1920s and 1930s. Then in the 1940s and 50s, the United States moved into what historians have called a tri-faith America, Protestant, Catholic, Jew. That was the title of a major book written by Will Herberg in 1955. And as America became more anti-communist, as it entered the Cold War, Catholics found it much easier to move into the political mainstream. And since then, Catholics have just been regular members of the American body politic. And that anti-Catholicism disappeared after 1960, when John F. Kennedy was elected as the first and still the only Catholic president in American history. Catholicism, like a lot of other aspects of American religion, certainly within Protestantism, a little less so in Judaism, but still even within Judaism to a certain extent, has become polarized along with American politics itself. I don't think American Catholics are as divided as Protestants are necessarily, but they have become more divided on partisan lines between Democrats and Republicans, and those partisan lines map out fairly neatly to, not always, but fairly neatly to political ideologies in terms of conservative politics and conservative and liberal politics. And so, in other words, people who are conservative in their religion are almost always now conservative in their religion. That's true for Protestants, and that's becoming more true for Catholics. The composition of the Supreme Court is really interesting because it has so many Catholics now. And that reflects a lot of trends that I've just talked about in American society. Neil Gorsuch, one of the most recent justices, is an evangelical Christian, but was raised as a Catholic, and like Vice President Pence, reflects these changes. And so the extent to which, when you're asking if conservative Catholicism provides an ecumenical glue to the broader Christian right, the answer is yes. And we can see it in people like Gorsuch and like Pence, where the line between conservative Catholic and then evangelical Protestant, which, up until say 40 years ago was drawn with a very, very, very hard line. And those two groups would not cooperate on anything other than maybe anti-communism. That line is more or less disappeared now, and there's a lot of fluidity in those identities. The interesting thing is the extent to which Trump has deliberately played to that, and has really forced the issue. As I was saying before, in his use of religion and politics and religion and foreign policy, he is really pushing these issues, including Catholicism, as hard as he can, and appealing to his base and trying to rally people to his, not necessarily people who are undecided or liberal Catholics or liberal Protestants or others, but trying to rally people who would naturally support his policies and naturally support his very conservative judicial appointments, not just to the Supreme Court, but all through the federal bench, in the district courts and the appeals courts, and trying to bring those people to his side. So in that sense, Trump is absolutely using conservative Catholicism as a political weapon. And we can see this even in him saying that Joe Biden isn't really a man of faith, even though Joe Biden is a Catholic, and by everything we know about Joe Biden, is an observant Catholic. Maybe not the most theologically conservative person, but he's certainly an observant Catholic. That's not necessarily a new trick. George W. Bush tried to do that, and did that, I shouldn't say tried to do that, did that fairly successfully with John Kerry in 2004. John Kerry, also a Catholic and an observant Catholic, but George W. Bush played that card. So that was fairly effective, but even George W. Bush didn't play it nearly as hard or aggressively as Donald Trump is. And whether that's successful, whether the appointment of Justice Barrett will help Trump's cause in that sense, is an open question. I have a feeling that it will definitely rally conservative Catholics and also conservative Protestants, evangelicals, to Trump's side, but I don't think they needed much rallying anyway. I think they were already there and they were already going to show up. What I think might happen is this could backfire on Trump in an electoral sense, in that the appointment and the possibility that things like Roe v. Wade might be overturned, that the Affordable Care Act might be declared unconstitutional, that might actually rally a greater number of people who were maybe not wild about Joe Biden, who are maybe on the fence, maybe weren't going to vote, that it might bring more people to the polls voting against Trump. So we'll have to see what happens.